All right, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for being here for our Science on Tap. I know for those folks in the room, it's a beautiful day outside, but if it helps at all, it's getting warmer and warmer each day until Friday. So you haven't missed it by coming in today. So we thank you for being here. Just a reminder, this is a hybrid event. So we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks that are online, your cameras, mics, and screen shares are disabled because this is a Zoom format, or sorry, a webinar format. But we do hope that you put any questions into the chat box and we'll get them at the end of today's presentation. If you have any technical issues, you can also put those into the chat box and our volunteer, Roseanne, we'll make sure that she notifies one of us in the room and we can get those fixed. So use that chat box to interact with us. For folks in the room, we're also going to get to questions at the end of both of our presenters today. And you're going to need a mic to do that because otherwise the recording, we can't hear your questions, nor can the folks online. So at the end of today's presentation, if you just raise your hand, you'll watch me run around and I'll hand out this mic. Or if you prefer, you can go to the mic stand up there and ask your question to our presenters. I also just wanted to celebrate again that we're able to eat and drink in the auditorium tonight because we have custodians that are on site. However, Brett has told me to call him out. Please don't spill your red wine if you can. But if you do spill, Miguel is in the room. Miguel's down here. He's got a cleanup box. Just raise your hand, let him know, and he will come and help you make sure that red wine does not stain our pretty floor. But thank you all for being here and listening to me give some of the instructions. I appreciate it. Behind one of our speakers is a sign-up sheet. Only if you are not on our listserv, if you're not getting these announcements by your email and you would like to, you can sign up there. Otherwise, you can get them on our website. If you go to HMSC, go to the events page, everything you need to get onto any of our events, the seminars, the Science on Taps is all right there. So you can get it that way, or you can sign up on our listserv. Wanted to make a quick announcement for our next month's Science on Tap. We have kind of an exciting one on May 24th. We have our 2023, one of our 2023 Laverne Weber visiting scientist, Dr. Andrew Reed, who is a distinguished professor of marine biology at Duke University, who will be here with us talking about distangling science, politics, and conservation using the northern white whale is kind of a species to talk about. So we're really excited to have him come and join us. So that will be on May 24th, same place, same time. So come and join us for that. Also wanted to let folks know that these events are recorded. And so if you're interested in watching this recording or sharing it with others, again, if you go to that events page on the HMSC website, you can get all of our recordings. I also wanted to just promote that this is the third of 3 talks that are of similar focus. So these 2 are bringing it home tonight. We're excited to have them. But if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the lens of Kelp health about sea otters, we have a talk about the possible feasibility of sea otters on our seminar page. Michelle from U.S. Fish and Wildlife talked about that a few weeks ago. On Marine Science Day, we had Sarah Gravem talk about the health of kelp beds relation to Pycnopodia, which is a sunflower star. And then we have our team tonight who's going to be talking about a slightly different focus. But so if you're interested in this topic, check out those recordings. Talking about who we have here tonight, we have Tom Calvanese and Ford Evans, who will be our speakers. They're going to speak back to back, and then we'll take those questions like we talked about. Tom Calvanese earned his master's in fisheries science degree with the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at OSU, researching adult rockfish movement and behavior at Redfish Rocks in Port Orford. He became familiar with the kelp forest habitats like Port Orford Reef while working as a commercial sea urchin diver. And so he remained at Port Orford after graduation and is now the station manager of the Port Orford Field Station, which is part of OSU's Marine Studies Initiative. Tom will be talking tonight representing the Oregon Kelp Alliance. And if you didn't notice, there's some swag outside. So check that out. I'm sure he'll promote that as well. Our second speaker tonight is going to be Ford Evans. He is a research associate with OSU's Coastal Oregon Marine Experimental Station here at Hatfield. His research focuses on sustainable aquaculture of shellfish and seaweed in the Pacific Northwest. Ford got his bachelor's from Pitzer College, his master's from Auburn University in aquaculture, and his PhD in fisheries science at OSU. These two researchers tonight are going to talk to us about some emerging issues around the state of kelp forest in Oregon and beyond. So I'm going to hand it off to both of them. Make it go green. Turn that light off.
It's green.
Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Awesome. Well, thanks for the intro, Cinnamon, and thanks everyone for being here. And as Cinnamon just said, I'm Tom Calvanese, and I'm here representing the Oregon Kelp Alliance. And I'm going to just start by telling you guys a little bit about what is the Oregon Kelp Alliance. And as soon as I can get my technology to respond, I will do that. Okay. Yay. Thanks, Cinnamon. So I'm going to do my best to not keep looking over my shoulder and just trust you guys are seeing what I'm seeing. So what is the Oregon Kelp Alliance? Really emerged out of communities that we're starting to see some changes in the kelp forests here in Oregon. And this is something that's occurred all over the world. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's really an alliance of people that are coming to this issue from so many different perspectives: scientists, students, divers, chefs, resource managers, all sharing this concern and interest in Oregon's kelp forests. What's going on? How do we understand it better? And what do we do about what we're seeing? So that's in essence what the Oregon Kelp Alliance is. And if you share those concerns and interests, you too can be part of the Oregon Kelp Alliance. So let's talk a little bit about kelp first. This is just a slide showing a bunch of different types of kelp that are found around the world. Mostly today, I'll be talking about the bull kelp, that if you've taken a walk on the beach in Oregon late in the year, you've probably seen it washed up. Sometimes it's called bullwhip kelp. Looks, it has that big long whip, it has a hold fast. And you see it in this diagram off to the far right. That's called the Nereocystis, is the bull kelp that we're talking about. But we see them around the world in these sort of temperate nearshore oceans. And all these different types of kelp appear around the world. And again, if you look at that narrow band along the west coast of North America, I think it's in purple in this diagram, that's sort of the range of the Nereocystis. And certainly here in Oregon, that's most of what we see. We do have a little bit of Macrocystis, the giant kelp, that shows up in a couple places in Oregon, pretty much around Cape Arago, but mostly what we have is bull kelp. So why do we care about kelp? I mean, I think the big reason is that this is a foundation species, which means it really forms the basis of a whole ecosystem, sort of kind of a kelp forest habitat. I like the term forest really because it's sort of a three-dimensional habitat. It's not just providing habitat for the little creepy crawly things on the bottom, like the abalone and the urchins and the anemones, but also for all these fish that live up in the water column, both adults and juveniles, excuse me, that really depend on that kelp forest habitat. It buffers the shoreline, so it protects the shore from some of the high energy ocean activity that occurs. And even in a lot of places in the world, and more now, people are starting to cultivate kelp as a food source. So it has all of these different sort of attributes that we value. And also, a recent paper did a pretty good job of kind of trying to add up, like, what's the monetary value of all of these different kelps? And I'll just draw your attention to the orange band along the west coast of North America and the calculations that Egger et al. Put together in a paper just published recently, came up with $142,000 of value per square meter per year in a bull kelp forest. And if you add that all up in that region where the bull kelp is found, it's something like $4.5 billion a year. So it's not just pretty to look at and happy place for fish to hang out, but it's really adding a lot of value to our economy and our entire world. So staying at the global level, the Oregon Kelp Alliance is joining other similar groups around the world right now as part of the Global Kelp Forest Alliance. And this group is coming together to join forces and develop a plan, and what is now being called the Kelp Forest Challenge, and just launched this out of Australia a couple of months ago, and collectively are saying, really need to take action on this. And what you're seeing, if you can see it in this giant screen, you probably can, that there's now a Kelp Forest Challenge target for 2030 that's coming in at around 38,000 hectares that have been pledged, and about another 7,000 for kelp forest protection. But the 2040 goals are showing up there in larger type, about 1 million hectares by 2040 to restore, and about 3 million hectares by 2040 to protect. This is an ambitious goal, but the groups around the world that are seeing a similar phenomenon are sharing the concern and the urgency of taking action on this issue. So I'm happy to say that the Oregon Kelp Alliance is part of that, and we're looking forward to working with that group, and we're developing our own pledge right now. So coming back to Oregon, like I said, we typically talk about bull kelp. And here in Oregon, along the coast of Oregon, a lot of the sort of the bulk of the bull kelp forests are found kind of on the south shore, the south coast. So from Cape Arago down to Brookings, and there's two sort of primary, or the largest kelp forests along the Oregon coast are found off Orford Reef, the Orford Cape Blanco Reef Complex, I guess I would call it. And then south of there, off Gold Beach, the Rogue Reef Complex. There are other kelp forests along the coast of Oregon, and I'll get into that in a minute, but these are sort of the two largest ones, and they tell really different stories that I'm gonna sort of talk about for a minute. Also gonna take a little sip of water. So just this last year, we've been doing some drone work. Dr. Sarah Hamilton's been leading our drone program, and I want to just show you a couple of the mosaics that she's put together, looking at some of the sites that we're working in, right? One of them is Nellie's Cove in Port Orford, which has been historically had a pretty persistent kelp beds, but over the last few years, things have really changed, and it's currently pretty much an urchin barren, and it's where we've been directing some of our attention in terms of kelp forest restoration. And we started those activities in 2021, and those will continue into this year. We compare that to Drake Point at Cape Arago, and you'll notice here that there is still some kelp bed there that looks pretty good. And I'll talk later about how Arago is a really interesting place where we're seeing both healthy kelp forests and urchin barrens in the same location. And then, not to leave the North Coast out, about Cape Lookout, here's a screenshot from some drone footage that was taken just a couple of years ago, showing the nearshore kelp bed there that was looking pretty good, but we're also seeing signs of changes there, loss of kelp, increase in urchin population. So what is going on in the kelp forest in Oregon? We've been starting to talk lately about this idea of kind of like a perfect storm for the kelp forest here and in a lot of places. Many of you have probably heard about the warm blob that occurred some years back. How many people have heard that? Like everybody. So problem with this warm water is kelp really needs cold, nutrient-rich water. So when that warm water was pushing up against the nearshore ocean, it was really starving the kelp of those nutrients. And the kelp had a couple of really bad years. And then right around the same time, I'm sure you've all heard about sea star wasting, that sort of ravaged sea star populations up and down the West Coast. And in particular, it really wiped out the Pycnopodia, or the sunflower sea star, which is actually a predator of sea urchins. So we've got some bad years for kelp, a loss of a kelp grazer, and then following that, a big population boom of purple sea urchins. So now we have this kind of perfect storm situation. Bad years for kelp, bad years for urchin predators, good years for urchins that eat kelp. And we also see that in the fishery. Cinnamon mentioned that I was an urchin diver 10 years ago in Port Orford. And the picture on the left is what things looked like a lot back then and till fairly recently. This is from 2014, a nice healthy harvest of red sea urchins from Orford Reef. But if you look at the panel to the right, that's a map from a group called Kelp Watch that's using Landsat data and analyzing it, looking at kelp cover over time. And that image is from the last quarter of last year. And what you're seeing there is a sort of a shadow of where the kelp forests at Orford Reef and Blanco Reef used to be. And you can see a tiny little dot down there in the lower left that shows you what it saw last fall. So it's a pretty devastating loss of what had been a very persistent and productive fishery. And at this point, urchin fishermen haven't pulled viable sea urchin out of Orford Reef for years. They are typically working at rogue reef. And this is one of the reasons why. So one of the other sort of confounding things is that it doesn't look the same everywhere. If you look at Redfish Rocks or Orford Reef, you can see these serious declines, pretty persistently not having the kelp there. But if you look at Rogue Reef in the last few years, we've seen an actual increase in kelp coverage. And of course, that's why the urchin divers are working down there. And then if you look at Cape Arago, it's sort of up and down, it's bumping along, good years, bad years, but it seems to sort of be maintaining based on those Landsat data. So what is Orca doing at this point? Well, this year we're launching a pretty ambitious project funded by the National Centers for Coastal and Ocean Sciences to do an in-depth status report of the kelp forests in Oregon, to get a handle on what is going on and to develop a restoration plan that we should be releasing next year. These are some of the leaders and rock stars of this effort. Dr. Sarah Hamilton, an OSU graduate, kelp forest aficionado and expert, has just come aboard as the scientific coordinator for Orca, and she's leading that part of the project, working with Dr. Aaron Galloway from OIMB. He's leading a team of scientific divers that'll be doing a lot of the scientific diver surveys, focusing a lot on Cape Arago region. Dr. Sarah Gravem, that you heard about earlier, is going to be sort of focusing on just organizing all of these data that are going to be coming in from diver surveys, from aerial drone surveys, ROV surveys, and also integrating some of the historical data sets that we have access to. And then Dan Abbott of Reef Check is leading the teams of citizen science divers that'll be doing a lot of the survey work. There are others that I didn't picture here that also deserve recognition. Jim Burke and Doug Batson and Ann at the Oregon Coast Aquarium are going to be major partners in this as well, focusing a lot on the Central Coast. And then we've got so many other volunteers and divers and boat captains, and the list goes on. And I'm happy to report we just brought aboard our full-time program coordinator, Elise Coachman, who you'll get to know pretty soon. She's just getting started and getting up to speed. We're also working hard right now to secure the resources we're going to need to execute this restoration plan. So we're piloting some work that I'll talk about in a minute, but we understand this is a big problem. We're going to really need to invest and build capacity to conduct these restoration projects. And we're really looking beyond just the urchin problem to embrace more of an ecosystem-based approach that includes grazer control of urchins, but then also actively seeding and outplanting kelp, and potentially, hopefully, be able to reintroduce some of these predatory sea stars. And of course, you guys have heard already about the Alaka Alliance and the work they're doing to reintroduce sea otters. The way we're thinking about that right now is that's kind of like a long view project. It's going to take a while to execute that if it's possible. And for now, we feel like there's a lot of work that we need to get done right now. So we're really taking on the urgency of this, and that's why we're pushing hard on these projects. So these are the sites that that have been identified by divers up and down the Oregon coast, from people who have been there and spent time in the ocean and said, hey, that thing you're seeing in Nellie's Cove, we're seeing it at Macklin Cove in Brookings. We're seeing it at Cape Lookout up in Tillamook and up and down the coast. So these are the sites we've identified as targets for this restoration work for now. There'll probably be others in the future. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of what that might look like with the work we did at Nellie's Cove in 2021. This is just a depiction of what changed from 2017 to 2020, where Nelly's Cove was a very healthy kelp bed, pretty persistent year after year. And by 2020, it was just gone. The work begins with scientific surveys conducted by Reef Check. These are some of the species we focus on in this work because they're kind of key to the question. We look at others, but the urchins and the kelp and the abalone and the sea stars are the ones we're really kind of paying attention to. And then we had a local commercial fisherman dub our group of divers the kelp forest defenders and donated a bunch of halibut to our hungry diver group the first weekend we got out there, which I thought we kind of agreed that was a great moniker for the group. And you can see one of the divers holding up the very high-tech device that we use to cull purple sea urchins, which is basically a hammer. So we did some of this work through 2021, through the summer, 3 weekends. These are some of the numbers. I won't walk you through all of this, but the take-home message is this is a lot of work. It takes an effort, and it took about 100 dives over 3 weekends to remove 47,000 something purple sea urchins from Nelly's Cove. And that was about a third of the study site that we're focusing on restoring. Then last summer, we went up north, worked with divers in Pacific City at Haystack Rock number 2, which we also know as Chief Kiawanda Rock. And here you can see us heading out to the rock with divers aboard Captain Kyle Dodson's dory. And it was great working with a dory boat captain and to go back and forth between the rock with teams of scuba divers and free divers working side by side to do this restoration work at that site, which is very valuable to that community and also, of course, to the ecosystem itself. And we worked with the Lincoln City Audubon Society volunteers because one of the things we're doing while we do this is we're taking samples of the purple sea urchins and we're cracking them open and we're measuring what's called a gonadal index or a gonad somatic index, which is the percentage of the urchin's weight that is made up of gonad, which is also known as uni. You're going to hear more about that from Ford, but I just want to give you a heads up. That's a thing we're going to be talking about. Then back to the Cape Arago site, where we've got this kind of head scratcher, where we've got what looks like kind of healthy kelp forest, but right next to it, we have what looks kind of like an urchin barren. So I want to give you a quick look into the work of one of our Oregon Sea Grant scholars last year, Brooke Ashcraft, who helped organize the restoration work up in Pacific City. And then she also organized an independent project at the Arago site. So she organized a bunch of us to go out there and laid out our study site with these little quadrats, about 10 of them, that extend from the kelp-dominated area of our site to the urchin-dominated area of our site. So we took 10 urchins out of each of those, and then the students went back to the lab and measured gonad index for each urchin and took the average from each of those locations. And these are the data that Brooke came up with. So what you're seeing is the average index for urchins taken out of the kelp bed where they have access to plenty of food off to the left. And then over at the right-hand side of the graph, you're seeing the average for the urchins that were taken out of the barren area where there isn't any food. And you can see a pretty clear trend that urchins that have access to food can grow gonads and they can comprise uni for the market. And this is going to play into what Ford's going to be talking about later. And vice versa, the urchins that are found in the urchin barren don't have access to food and they pretty much end up kind of getting starved out and they just can't produce gonads, aka uni. So I'm going to wrap things up with a little urchin anatomy lesson. So a lot of you have probably seen a kind of spiky ball called a sea urchin. And it's like, oh, that's a weird looking spiky thing. But there's so much more to it than that. If you see them in action underwater, and I think Ford's got a little surprise to show you later, you'll notice they have these little tube feet that kind of reach out between the spines. The urchin sort of hangs out in a space where it's kind of got some current going by, and that current hopefully is carrying some food items for it. And the urchin, the drift kelp will sort of get snagged on those spines, and the urchin will kind of reach up with its little tube feet and grab some food and move it down to its mouth, which turns out to be at the bottom of its body. And you might have heard about a thing called Aristotle's lantern. This is this sort of skeletal muscular apparatus the urchin uses to move its teeth around, get its teeth into that food and eat. And then you'll see those orange objects in the top of the figure. Those are the gonads of the urchin, aka uni. And the thing that doesn't show up really well here, but you'll see later in some of Ford's pictures, is that the urchin has pentaradial symmetry. So it has this really cool body plan where instead of like biradial, like we have 2 of everything, they have 5 of everything, which is kind of freaky, but also really interesting. And it's interesting for the market because instead of just 2 uni per urchin, there are 5. So that comes into play later in some of the marketing parts of this that you'll hear more about. And then I guess I want to just take a minute to talk about zombie urchins. How many of you guys have heard this term? Yeah, some of you have heard it. So what's a zombie urchin? Well, it's really interesting that one of the questions we get a lot is, well, if there are all these urchins out there, and you got this urchin fishery, why don't you guys just go and get all the urchins and bring them into the market and turn them into something worthwhile instead of a pest? Well, here's the problem. When the urchins eat everything in sight, like they have in this photo, which I took just south of Port Orford, just south of Mount Humbug, this is what it looks like. This used to be a kelp forest. Now it's an urchin barren. And the urchins that are there are these zombie urchins. They've eaten everything in sight. And now, do they just eat until they starve and then die? No, unfortunately, they just sort of reabsorb their gonads, any other energy they have at inside their body, and then they lower their metabolic rate, and they go into a sort of a state of torpor or hibernation, aka zombie urchin. They're not dead, but they're not really living. It's a kind of a weird state to be in, I guess. But the problem with it is that the bull kelp is an annual. So it has to regrow each year. That's why you see the big rack on the beach at the end of the year, because the kelp has grown, has reached its full potential, the winter storms rip it out, and then next spring it has to start all over again. And it grows really fast and it does a great job of that. The problem is if it tries to do that in the middle of that, it doesn't stand a chance. That little baby kelp tries to grow and that zombie urchin just wakes up and goes, oh, nom, nom, nom. That's awesome, thank you. So it never gets a chance. So this is important because it plays into these questions about, can we do a fishery? Can the otters come and just eat all the urchins? Can we eat the urchins? And the problem is there's nothing to eat. You'll see later, you'll crack open one of these urchins, and there are people in this room who've done it. I'm looking at you, Paula, and you're opening up the urchin to see what's going on inside, and it's like, oh, nothing. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle, and you're going to hear more about that from Ford. And I'm just going to recap here with sort of what we're doing right now, the NOAA project, the big status report recovery plan, the pilot restoration work we're doing, which we're hoping to build on, work that was started with funding from the Pew Charitable Trust. And then the project that Ford is going to be talking more about, the co-culture work that's being supported by a generous grant from Oregon Sea Grant. And we hope to continue that work. And if you want to know more about the Oregon Kelp Alliance, you can find us at oregonkelp.com. You can follow us on your favorite social media channel. And I also, we just launched some merch. So check that out. There's actually a QR code outside if you want to check that out. There's a sample long sleeve t-shirt out there. And thanks to the interns who made that happen. And I'll leave you with this lovely image of what we're trying to hang on to or bring back where we've lost it. And thanks so much for your time, and hopefully I didn't take too much of it.
All right, everyone, we're going to do a quick switch over. So if we can switch the mic, and then I'm going to end this program.
Switching mic.
Hang in there with us. All right, Roseanne, does that look okay on your side? All right, go ahead, forward.
Okay. All right, can everyone hear me? I think I've got this on proper. Excellent. All right, so as Tom mentioned, I'm gonna pick things up here, and what the project is really focusing on is this idea of co-culturing Pacific dulse and purple sea urchins in land-based tanks. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the details of it all, but essentially, as Tom pointed out, the urchins, the purple urchins that are in these barrens are essentially marketless. They have no market value because they have no roe or uni inside of them. So the idea is to take those animals, bring them into basically a land-based facility, fatten them up, as cold as that may sound, and then hopefully they become now a marketable product and can be sold as seafood. So the first maybe slide I wanted to show up is that, in fact, you can eat urchins. Just at the last Marine Science Day, a lot of questions had to do with uncertainty about how exactly do you eat a sea urchin. And most of you who have had it probably have had uni sushi. However, more and more you're seeing sea urchin roe or uni being presented in different ways, including just that bottom left corner being cracking open an animal at the dock. Also, uni has a nice buttery flavor, umami flavor that can be used as a good ingredient in other items, just such as that uni pasta sauce there. And also, as Tom mentioned, the orange, what we're actually talking about is the reproductive organ of the animal. 5 pieces per urchin. So it is seafood, and there is a commercial fishery for this animal. Just a couple stats on the bottom right there. Global fisheries, at least as of 2015, were about 85 million pounds landed of all the urchin species in the world. US accounted for about 11 million pounds of that. In the US, California is the main producer. Oregon comes in at about 500,000 pounds. And something to note, on the left, there's a graph of landings in the state of Oregon. And there are 2 species that are primarily commercially harvested, the red urchin and the purple urchin. You can see that the industry, the numbers are a little bit small there, but it goes from 100,000 pounds up to 700,000 pounds. The commercial fishery is primarily focused on the red sea urchin. Now, that's not only because the uni from the red sea urchin is actually highly prized throughout the world, but also it's a very large urchin. So it's very efficient in terms of harvesting, as well as processing. The processing involves cracking the animal open and pulling the uni, the gonads out, cleaning it and so forth. Purple urchins are also commercially harvested, but to a very small degree, partly because they're so small. It's difficult for, in fact, processors typically won't buy purple sea urchins because they're too small. It's too inefficient to process those animals. And as you can see in Oregon, purple urchins typically account for about 1% of the total commercial harvest. The other thing to notice, if I extended this graph further back in time, you'd see the total urchin landings bouncing around about 500,000 pounds. And you see about the time Tom was talking about the perfect storm hitting, you see this drop in urchin landings. Now that's may or may not be due to the absence of, say, red urchins per se, but it's the quality of the urchins. They're just not marketable because they don't have the kelp to eat. They're not fattening up their gonads. There are a couple different market outlets on the right here. Is what you'll see with a commercial harvest of red urchins that are being sold to a processor. This is essentially a wholesale market that they're selling into. The processor will then purchase these animals and put quite a bit of effort to opening them up, taking the uni out, cleaning it, and then grading it, and then ultimately shipping it off to either a restaurant or export market. So there's a lot of effort that the processor is putting into it, and consequently, the wholesale price is relatively low. Currently, it's about $3 a pound here in Oregon, but $3 to $5 a pound in California. However, the processors can move quite a bit of volume, so they can make up for, divers can make up for the low dollar per pound by moving a lot of volume, if they can, when times are good. More and more, however, you're seeing people, divers and retailers selling into the market where they're selling directly to consumers. This is a picture of the Santa Barbara Saturday fish market down in Santa Barbara, and you can see they are selling, today's special is uni. And I don't know if you can make this out, but they're selling whole cracked urchins for $10 to $15 per individual. And what's interesting is the purple urchins here. Purple urchins aren't really going to enter the wholesale market, as I mentioned, they're too small, but you are seeing purples showing up when you're selling direct to consumers. And in this case, it's $3, sorry, 3 individuals for $20, or if you forgive my rounding, that's about $7 per individual, which is actually pretty good. And 100 grams, if we assume these purples are about 100 grams, you're looking at about $32 a pound live weight. So you're selling these animals for about 10 times, the diver or retailer can be selling these animals for about 10 times as much as they could if they're selling to the wholesale market. Problem here, and a big difference, is the volume that you can move there. You can't sell that many urchins to the folks at the Saturday market. So if you're a diver and times are good, you're collecting, you have a nice healthy reef to access, you're collecting healthy, nice fat urchins. You can sell into the wholesale market if you'd like to, if you have a lot of volume. There's a lot of steps here, but you usually get a nice product at the end. You can also try selling direct to consumers, and this is usually a much less processed animal, maybe cracked open and cleaned up a little bit. But what do you do if you don't have access to a nice, healthy kelp forest? For instance, what if you're pulling low quality, if you only have access to low quality animals, such as these barren sourced purple urchins? Is there something we can do with all of these purple urchins that are out there to try to increase their market value? And you can begin to explore this idea, and this is sort of what our research hinges on here, this idea of gonad enhancement. My joke here is don't Google that, because you'll head down a very dark place. But so let me explain what this is. What this is basically is taking animals from, here's a picture of an urchin barren. You got your purple urchins, a resource poor environment. You pull these animals out and they're effectively going to be empty. This, in fact, this may be Paula, who's here today, may have taken this photo. The guts are removed, and what you're seeing is no gonad whatsoever there. So it's really not a marketable product. The idea of gonad or roe enhancement is to take these zombie urchins, usually bring them to some sort of land-based facility, feed them a healthy diet, so introduce them to a high nutrient environment, and hopefully over time they'll naturally build up their gonadal material to the point where they now can be sold as seafood. Now, we didn't come up with this idea. This has been done. This idea of gonad enhancement has been done studied for decades. Different algal species have been looked at. Different urchin species have been looked at all over the world. But what we're looking at is sort of focusing on the Oregon context, and specifically, we're interested in how does Pacific dulse, I'll talk a little bit more about this. This is a red seaweed. Is this a good fodder that you can feed these purple urchins in an effort to try to enhance their gonads, and therefore make them a marketable product and try to put a little bit of top-down pressure on what's going on at the reefs out there? So we've talked a lot about urchins, a little bit about the seaweed that we're dealing with here, Pacific dulse. It is native to the area. It ranges from Alaska down to San Luis Obispo. In the wild, it looks like this, nice long fronds or long phalli. And when you culture it, the morphology can be highly variable, but typically what you'll see is a morphology that looks like this. Still, you have nice flat phalli, but it's a much more highly branched plant when you get it into a land-based culture system. So why are we focusing on, why do we want to pick Palmaria mola, Pacific dulse? I'll give 3 reasons. One is that we've researched this particular species here at Hatfield Marine Science Center quite a bit, in fact, with research dating back to the mid-1980s when it was first brought here to study. Part of that research, we found that this is a highly nutritious seaweed that supports rapid growth in other marine herbivores, such as red abalone. And a third reason, also partly coming from our research here, is that there are land-based farms that have scaled production of this seaweed so that you're now producing this at a commercial scale. And that's important when you think about the long-term applicability of this land-based co-culture system that I'm going to talk about. A little bit more about the what happens in the co-culture system. Basically, what you end up doing is, if we look first at this dulse tank, and let me back up a little bit and say we call it co-culture deliberately because we are growing 2 animals. We actually want to keep both the, not animals, 2 species. We want to keep the dulse happy and growing. Same thing for the urchins. We want to keep them growing as well. So this is unique compared to other gonad enhancement, row enhancement operations. Trying to get rid of that. What you see in the dulse tank is, this is where we can sort of start the cycle here. You want to grow your dulse, and it is a plant, so it's going to photosynthesize. And what it needs, particularly like your house plant, is sunlight. It's going to need some nutrients, a carbon source, water. And in a commercial environment, commercial dulse farm, those light comes in the form of ambient sunlight. Nutrient can come in either through the seawater or through fertilizer if you need it. We typically aerate, heavily aerate the water from the bottom, and this creates a nice circulation, keeping the dulse plantlets in suspension. It also allows atmospheric carbon dioxide to more easily diffuse into the water, and that serves as a carbon source for the seaweed in support of photosynthesis. The idea is then you then take your surplus dulse, move it over to, in this case, we have a separate sea urchin tank, and you're going to use that to feed your urchins. Now they're living, particularly if they're barren sourced purple urchins that you bring in here, give them lots of dulse, and hopefully at this point they're going to be putting on, increasing their gonad content. Now, ideally, you would also have the effluent from this urchin tank cycle back into your dulse tank. The reason for that is any sort of nitrogenous waste that comes from the urchins, such as ammonia, can actually be readily absorbed by the dulse. And on that note, dulse actually is a fantastic biofilter. It does very well at absorbing nutrients. So if managed correctly, you actually can have very little nutrients in the effluent coming out of a system like that. So the dulse is really serving 2 purposes: one, food, and also as a biofilter built into the system. So we wanted to take a look at the feasibility. How feasible is something like this on the Oregon coast? There are a few things we didn't know. One was, will purple urchins consume dulse? And if they will, how much? Oh good, that's muted. We weren't concerned, actually, that they would consume the dulse based on their voracious feeding behavior in the kelp forest. We were pretty certain they'd eat it. But when you're talking about managing a farm on shore, you want to also be able to quantify how much they're eating. And to answer those questions, to cut right to the chase here in the interest of time, yes, they will consume dulse, and we found that they consume it at about 4% of their body weight per day, which doesn't seem like very much. But when you start talking about how many days you have these animals in culture, and also the numbers of animals that you have in culture, this can add up. So again, what the important thing here to consider is, if you're the farmer, you're running this co-culture operation, you want to make sure you're balancing dulse production with dulse consumption. Also, the 5-part symmetry that Tom was talking about is very evident in their jaws in the Aristotle lantern. And this also, I think, is a little bit frightening if you look at it for too long. There, that jaw moving around. The next question, so food consumption is very important, particularly from a management standpoint, if you're trying to run this co-culture farm. Another question, really sort of where the rubber hits the road, is does a Pacific dulse support rapid gonad growth in barren-sourced purple urchins? That's really why we're bringing them onto land. And to do this, we wanted to do sort of a farm trial, a farm-based trial. So we partnered with Oregon Seaweed, and they actually have 2 commercial farm sites here in Oregon, one down in Bandon where they started, another one up in Garibaldi. They expanded up there. But what we end up having, particularly with this site down in Bandon, is this excellent opportunistic co-location happening here. We, as Tom mentioned, sort of the hub of kelp force and therefore the urchin fisheries down in Southern Oregon. So we've got urchin divers, we've got, unfortunately, the urchin barrens. Also, unfortunately, we have a tremendous number of empty, valueless purple urchins, but we also have this land-based seaweed farm nearby. So this presented a perfect opportunity for us to set up our farm trial to see how well this idea works. So we partnered with Oregon Seaweed and the Port of Bandon and set up 2 2,000-liter urchin culture tanks there to test how quickly they'll put on gonad when only fed Pacific dulse. So as Tom mentioned, the way that we measure gonad content in an individual is something called gonad index. And as he mentions, the weight of the gonad divided by the weight of the individual times 100. So essentially the percentage of the total body weight that you can attribute to gonad material. And since a picture is worth 1,000 words, here's what they look like. Again, we'll thank Paola in the audience for some of these photos. Here is an animal with a very low gonad index. This would be something not unusual coming out of a urchin barren. A little bit of gonad material there, but otherwise empty. The guts have been removed here, so you're not seeing that, but you're also not seeing any gonad in there. This is probably slightly less than 10% of the body weight attributable to gonad. And then here, gonad index of about 15, 20% actually is beginning to look like a very marketable product here. It's worth your while to open up this animal, for example. So what did our results show? Well, this is a graph. Again, the numbers are a little bit small there, but on the y-axis, we have gonad index going from 0 up to 15%. Along the x-axis, days that we held them in culture. 2 treatments. One was an unfed, starved treatment, where basically what we called our barren control. And the other treatment is where we provided the urchins with as much dulse as they could eat. Times 0 is where they came in from the urchin barren. So they're coming in at about less than 2.5%, a gonad index of less than 2.5%. So they look a lot like this guy here. Over time, the unfed barren control doesn't change. That was expected. But you can see an almost immediate response in the bulking up of these animals when they have the opportunity to feed on dulse. And it's actually a nice, fairly rapid linear increase in the gonad index over time. I put this dotted line in here as a threshold, sort of a marketing threshold. You want to be above 10%, or typically it's understood that an urchin that has a gonad index above 10% is considered marketable. Below that, there's just not enough gonad material in there to consider it worthy of selling or buying. So we find that on average, the urchins reached that 10% point after 50 days. But to get, if you want to be certain about more of them being above this threshold, waiting 70, let's say 10 or 12 weeks is probably typical or a good, a prudent idea. So we've answered some critical questions that we didn't know before. One, yes, they will eat dulse, but more importantly, we know how much they'll eat. And the other question that we've answered is the fact that yes, a dulse is nutritionally sufficient to support rapid gonad development in purple urchins. Of course, the quicker you can have them put on that gonad growth, the better. That means the less time you are holding these animals on land, going from zero gonad index from a urchin barren up to, say, 10 or 15% in the shortest period of time, saving you time and money. So we were able to run a very preliminary farm budget model to try to put some numbers to this. We knew how much they grow, so we knew how much dulse we needed to produce. We knew how long they would have to stay on land, so things like labor and power and so forth could be factored in. I'm not going to go into the assumption. It was a fairly simple model, but I wanted to do something just to illustrate the point of the essential costs that are going to be associated with this co-culture operation. And the term that I ended up using, or the value that I ended up using, is something called break-even price. And in this case, the break-even price to cover the cost of production. So this is basically, how much do you need to sell your product for just to break even? And when we crunch these numbers, won't go into the details here, we find that a co-culture operation would have to sell their animals for about $14 per pound live weight. So that's much more than you could sell into, say, the wholesale market. If you try to do that, you'd be losing money. But when you translate that to an individual basis, you see that you can sell urchins for about, and break even if you sell your animals for about $3 per individual. Again, that seems expensive, but if you remember back to our Santa Barbara fish market booth, they were selling purple urchins for $7 per individual. So this is now sort of in the realm of possibility of being a viable, economically viable option. I've made all sorts of assumptions here, so don't blame me if you go try it, it doesn't quite work out. But the point is, this is pointing in the right direction, that this could be a viable enterprise. So just to reiterate that point, yes, if you are interested in doing something with all those purple urchins out there, or at least some of the purple urchins out there, that might be the way to say it, you can entertain and explore the idea of land-based co-culture, but you will need to get a premium price for your product, and that's probably going to require selling directly to consumers, or a slightly elongated value chain here. You can sell to let's say, a local restaurant who would then sell to the consumer. So the take-home message here, or messages here, is that purple sea urchins will readily consume Pacific dulse. Pacific dulse can support rapid growth, gonad growth in barren-sourced purple urchins held in land-based tanks. And charging a premium price will be required to cover the high operating costs associated with roe enhancement. That's probably the essential take-homes there. So thank you very much. I think we have a minute or two for questions.
All right. We covered a lot of ground, so I think we have some questions. I'm going to start with folks online, and then I'll come to the folks in the room. Roseanne, question online.
Yes. Let me go up here. What is the historical range of the kelp forest before the demise of Oregon sea otters?
Can you repeat that?
What was the historical range of the kelp forests before the demise of Oregon sea otters?
That's a great question. I would have to go out on a limb to answer it. That's like 100 years ago, and there has been some work done to try to resolve that question. You know, one thing we know is that where you have a kelp forest that's in a healthy state and it has otters in it, that's good. They help to control the urchin population, and they can maintain that sort of balance. So that's good. And we did have that here in Oregon. That was a long time ago. And there are other things that happened during that 100 years, like an abalone fishery, for example. And I think one of the challenges right now is for us humans to try to wrap our heads around what things were like 100 years ago. It's really hard to do, and there's so many variables. But I really appreciate the question. I'm sorry I don't have a really good answer for you, but I can tell you that if you reach out to us through our website, there are definitely people in the Alliance who can, scare that information up and get back to you with a solid answer. But I thank you for the question.
Perfect. Go ahead and put that on your collar so that it sounds a little better. And then any questions in the room?
Oh, you have one. Okay, cool.
To the same question kind of about the historical range, one of the histories of kelp forests on all of our coasts is that a lot of time and effort and investment was put into clearing the channels for navigation and commerce those 100 years ago or more. And so how does that fit into the restoration effort, the restoration challenges, and how, is a successful kelp reforestation going to adversely affect our fisheries or our navigational ocean needs?
Questions. All right, I'm going to give it a shot. Okay, well, I'll refer back to where I live. I live in Port Orford. So we have a commercial fishery and we have a channel that needs to get dredged for access. And that channel and most of those channels actually are in sandy bottom. And that's not good kelp habitat. So you typically won't see kelp growth in a navigational channel where it's in the sand and gets dredged. But the other thing I want to say, I kind of alluded to it a little bit in terms of kelp forest habitat and the value of it for fisheries. And I told you that little story about a local fisherman who donated a bunch of halibut to some kelp forest defenders and recognized that he did, and many do, and I do, recognize the importance of that habitat to the commercial fisheries. Not just the urchin fishery, but the ground fish fishery, the live fish fishery. All those fish live in the kelp forest as adults and as juveniles. And one of the things that really concerns me, and working with some folks at ODFW on some juvenile fish work, OSU and ODFW working together, tracking that over time. And I have a lot of concern about what happens when you lose that juvenile fish habitat. When you used to have a very healthy kelp forest, and I have very vivid memories of watching baby fish just raining out of the kelp canopy as an urchin diver. Well, if that canopy is not there, that juvenile fish habitat is not there. And where are those baby fish going to hang out? They need that protection. They're just basically little snacks out there. So, so I think there's some relationships for sure. And, but definitely the navigation.
I think you turned off your mic.
Sorry. To try to go around it.
All right. Question online.
Are there fewer potential holdfast structure after an urchin barren forms due to sand movement and burial?
These are.
We're doing good. No
All right,
softballs
give
coming
us
from
a
the
shot again.
audience.
Are there fewer holdfast structures? Absolutely, yeah, because the urchins will, they eat the drift kelp, and you might have noticed in a couple of those pictures where you'll see urchins, and it's typically the purple urchins that do this, and not the red urchins for some reason, where they'll literally climb up the stipe, and they will just start munching down all the way down. And once you get into a pretty full-on urchin barren, you don't see anything. The holdfasts are gone. They have eaten other things. They'll eat into acorn barnacles. They'll start nibbling on the coralline algae. You can find places where you are looking at bare rock, and you never see bare rock underwater in the ocean in Oregon, anywhere, because there's always something that's going to live on that rock. So when you go into a place where the urchins have come through and just really cleared it out, it's kind of shocking to see this bare rock underwater. So yeah, it takes out that habitat as well.
Okay.
Come on, you guys, give forward a hard question.
This will not be a hard question. Finance background here, not biology. Two-part question. Is there any flavor difference in between purple and red?
I personally don't know. You can go on.
Ever had a sea urchin before?
I have.
You have,
But-
okay.
But not not red. I have obviously had quite a bit of access to the purple ones, which are quite good. You know, it's interesting. This is how I'm going to deflect the question. It's interesting because what we are doing, to your question, what we're doing is growing these animals in a largely unnatural environment. This is a monoculture, or I should say a monoalgal diet that they're receiving, which is not natural already. And it's Palmaria mollis, a small red seaweed, which is also not natural. So something we are interested in looking at is how does that affect the uni taste or maybe texture, other measures of quality. For both the purple and the red urchins, it's, you know, a nice experiment. Compare land raised versus, I should say, co-culture fattened versus animals that are collected from the wild. That's something we're hoping to do, but I haven't. I can't speak to the difference between the two. I know online, if you try to purchase purples, they will highlight the differences between the two. Sweeter, I think, is something that they've said.
I can say I have, and I'll say that two things. I would say texturally, there's a pretty big difference. The red uni is just a larger uni. It's got more of like a bite to it. The purple is a lot sort of a softer, creamier kind of texture. And then flavor-wise, we did do just an ad hoc taste comparison where we grew up some purples, feeding them dulse, and then took some out of the wild that were primarily eating bull kelp. And we just did a blind taste test, like just asked people, like, give us your impressions. There was nothing scientific about it. But I will say from that experience, I would say there was definitely a difference. It was really interesting. I felt like the dulse-fed uni was milder, had less of a bitterness to it. And we even started to joke around about like, oh, we can start talking about like dulse-fed uni as a marketing strategy, which, hey, write that down.
Because at least from your presentation, right, the whole emphasis was red uni, how much more marketable that was. And it almost seems like the purple uni, when the marketers in Santa Barbara had them, were a little bit of an afterthought, like to kind of round out the offerings, maybe for people who didn't want to spend as much for the red uni, or maybe because they couldn't find as many red uni. However, your studies are all purple uni based, right? So in that sense, since you can at least from your preliminary numbers, at least match the price of the purple uni, I would say that this is a new market. You're not even really competing with them because their opportunity cost is so much greater for the red. I'm sorry, that wasn't really a question.
No, I agree. Yeah. And
Am I completely crazy?
and introducing uni as a locally sourced seafood, I think, is something that can be.
Have you
can be
tried
encouraged.
growing red uni in captivity? Do they not do as well, or?
Well, no, that's also something we're very interested in doing. How does this co-culture? So admittedly, this first round was, we have a lot of purple urchins. Let's see if we can fatten them up. But we are also interested in looking at, can you do the same thing with red urchins?
Okay, I'm going to take one more question online, and then for folks in the room, if you have questions, I think our presenters are going to hang out for just a few minutes and we can ask them. While I'm getting the question online, can one of you pull up something that has a contact information on one of your slides? I think somebody did. Maybe, maybe not. You can put it in the chat as well. Or we can get it after. That's okay too. Do we have a question coming online?
Yes, nice talk. Thank you. Urchin barrens have occurred in many locations, Central California in the 70s and 80s, Nova Scotia, the Gulf of Maine in the 80s, Diadema in the Caribbean, 70s and 80s. In many cases, these populations eventually fell victim to some form of wasting disease. In fact, echinoderms in general seem to be susceptible to viral infections, including crowns of thorn locally, wasting disease, and even holothurians. Any evidence of disease seen in these barrens for perhaps to consider this is a long-term management strategy if predators don't work.
So our survey divers are actually including observations of signs of a couple of different diseases that occur in urchins, one of them being black spot disease, aptly named, really easy to spot. So we're including that in the survey work, and we are seeing it here and there. And it is, everything that I just heard, I believe, is true, that, you know, given enough time, we might be able, you know, we might, if we can wait long enough, we might see that take care of the problem. But we're also, all of this is also happening in the amidst other changes that are occurring that have not occurred before. Things like temperature, you know, there are other issues that we're looking at. And so I think what you're looking at is a lot of folks agreeing that around the world, really, that maybe just waiting to see if it'll take care of itself might not be the best strategy. Even if that turns out to be true, maybe a lot of people don't want to wait for that. But we are watching for it. And I don't know, maybe, who knows, that might happen. I mean, that could be the beginning of another major shift. But one of the things that I think is really kind of stunning is to join with a group like the Kelp Forest Alliance and attend a global symposium, talking to people from literally around the world that are seeing the same thing everywhere. And that is, that's a lot to take in, and it's kind of motivating in a way. So I don't know, hopefully, if nothing else, then maybe decades from now, people will be talking about the great urchin die-off of 2030 something.
All right, everybody, I don't want to keep you too long on this beautiful sunny day. For folks online that we didn't get to your questions, I deeply apologize. But I think if you Google the Oregon Kelp Alliance, you can get contact information and you can reach out directly there. For folks in the room, thank you so much for being here. How about one more hand for our two presenters? All right, everybody, we'll see you next month. Thank you for being here. Okay, for folks online, we're putting contact info into the chat right now. So if you have questions that are outstanding, you can reach out to Tom directly.